Love Your Kitchen, Design in the Heart of the Home, proudly sponsored by Blum, the podcast where we explore the art of crafting your dream kitchen. I'm your host, Faye Newman, a freelance kitchen designer with a passion for creating spaces that truly reflect the heart of the home. It's because you've got your ovens directly behind you. So therefore, if you're getting anything sort of hot out of the oven, you can literally turn around, pop it down next to where you're already cooking by the hob. Also, another point to make is you don't necessarily have to go for induction if you want to go for a venting hob. It's good to note that there are venting hob options that allow for gas, and obviously they've got safety measures in place to make sure that the extraction itself isn't blowing out the gas sort of as you're using it. Still, overall cost-wise, it's more cost-effective to do the sink on the island and then still have the separate appliances, dependent on what choice you want to go for on the back wall. But we'll run through the comparing the labour and appliance costs now. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Love Your Kitchen podcast. As ever, thank you very much for joining me. Today's episode is going to be very relevant if you're looking to go and incorporate an island into your kitchen design. And not only just the island, but also maybe you need to incorporate an appliance on there, whether that's your sink or your hob. This is always an ongoing question that I get asked, throughout working with homeowners over the years. I think since sort of kitchen islands have been around, it's always a bit of a debate which one's going to be the most social, which one's going to be the more cost effective as well. Like, both have to obviously be channeled to get, either electricity or plumbing to the island, but which one outweighs from a cost perspective, and also looking at sort of like the pros and cons between the two. So this is what this episode is going to be all about. I'll be answering all of those questions that you have about whether to go for either your hob or your sink on your island. What we'll look into is we'll first look into sort of the purpose of why you're looking to go for a kitchen island in the first place, what you're hoping to gain from the space, and then we can sort of get more of an idea about what the preference would be with cost and everything aside. Then I'll also be talking about things to think about. So just in case there might be some installation elements that you're unsure about, or, you might have some questions that you have about how sort of the differences could work. Then I'll also be doing a cost comparison. So the way that I've worked out this cost comparison for you is I've looked at sort of averages of, say, like your venting hobs against sort of like a normal hob and an extractor, figured out the price differences for those, and looked into sort of average costs for like your plumbing, channeling out, that sort of thing. Obviously, this is all subjective, dependent on your project, but I thought if I can try and give like a good average of where they both sit, at least then you can sort of think, okay, so from a cost perspective, this option might be more like slightly cheaper, so therefore that might be a better option for you. It's just to make sure that you've got all the information to make the right decision for your project. And then I'll also be looking at the pros and cons too, which is very exciting. So there's a lot to get through in today's episode. So first of all, I want you to think about like, what is the actual purpose of you having a kitchen island? I think we all see on Pinterest, don't we, beautiful big kitchens, and then they've got a massive kitchen island in the middle. So it's very inspiring and aspirational to think, yes, when I've got a space big enough to be able to incorporate a kitchen island, that's going to be a main focus for you. But really think about, okay, what do you need from that island? Do you need additional worktop space? Is it a place for storage? Do you want to make a bit of a feature out of it? Like in this space that I'm in now, they've got it so it's almost like a farmhouse table vibe where it's lifted off the floor. Is it a case of maybe the way that the setup is now, maybe you're knocking through into a dining room, so you're losing sort of an additional wall where maybe your hob was originally, so therefore you've got to now think, okay, we've got to rejig the space and think to see whether we need to put the hob on the island now. Or it might be a case of you want to try and keep an appliance off your island, but maybe you don't have the choice for that, just due to the overall layout of the space, especially if you're wanting to incorporate lots of sort of tall cabinetry. Naturally, that's going to take up some space in order to be able to, have your hob or your sink, unless you want it within a cupboard, which is popular now. But again, from a cost perspective, that is going to increase the price, building furniture around said sort of appliances. So it just depends. It's really just focusing on, okay, what do you actually want to gain from the space. So for instance, if your hob's on the island, is it going to be your main prep space, for instance? If you've got your, your dishwasher, sink, bin on the island, is that going to be like your clean up space? And then you've got your kitchen zone sort of behind you. What do you need that space to give you? And it might be a case of, you're incorporating seats on the island. And, some clients say to me, I love the idea of having a hub on the island. It's so social. It's really great for, watching the kids if they're like, in the corner on the dining room table doing their homework, or maybe next to you, or watching, some TV. You want to be where you are the most, sort of if you're cooking away. You want to be able to be interactive and it be a bit more of an immersive experience for you and your guests. It might be a case of you don't want to, have spluttering pots and everything, around by your guests, especially if, you're cooking very smelly food, things like that. So that's why you might want to go for your sink, or equally, maybe it might be a case of you want to go for quite a statement sink, whether that's a beautiful big Belfast sink or, big undermount sink, and you want to make that quite a feature, and your island is a statement in maybe your kitchen design. So therefore you want to keep it, looking, super tidy, and you like the look of having that on your island rather than sort of against a wall. And you might not even use that sink to do hand washing. Gone with the days now where, you're not putting your glassware in the dishwasher anymore, because they've improved so much that you're not getting that cloudiness on the glasses and things like that. You might still do a bit of hand washing, but it might be a case of, okay, you want it to be sort of the tidiest place where you literally rinse, put away straight away, wipe it down, and then it's sorted, and then you've got sort of the mess of the cooking prep space and things behind you. Whatever that looks like for you, it's really start sort of thinking, okay, like, how am I actually going to use that space? Which is what I always say whenever I am trying to help you solve a design decision. Really look at the functionality first of how you use the space. Obviously, it's always great to get advice from friends and family, but it's really about, what works for you, your family, like when you're hosting, what would you prefer? But also, of course, the cost, which we'll be going into more detail on later on in this episode. Before we do that, I've got a few design examples to show you to help you with the, decision making and the ideology of what could actually potentially work for your space, and to maximize the kitchen flow. I'll give you a few examples. Sometimes that can, resonate with certain different projects. The first kitchen design example I've got to show you is this beautiful timeless in-frame kitchen. And there's quite a good story regarding sort of the, the flow and sort of what we needed to adapt in this kitchen design in order to determine sort of whether to have the sink or the hob on the island. So to give you a bit of a background on these clients, they were very busy business owners, and it was just the two of them for the majority of the year, but they like to host, they like to have people over, and also they like to cook as well. That was a really prevalent part of the whole, of the whole design meetings with me. Like, they really wanted to make sure that they're not just buying a kitchen for show. They wanted to make sure that from a function perspective and, choice of appliances, things like that, like, it was really important to them, as well as clever storage. The reasons for why these particular clients incorporated a sink on the island and didn't go for like a hob with a ceiling extractor or a venting sort of, induction hob, was one, they've got an Arga and they liked cooking with their Arga. And it was actually positioned the opposite side to where it's actually showing now on the screen, with the same mantle, above it. So we moved both of those to the opposite side to keep that timeless look. And equally, they, as I mentioned, they loved cooking with it and they were used to using the Arga. It keeps with the overall scheme, but also from a functional element, it works for them. They had equal amount of prep space either side. So they had sort of 600 mil to the far side with the post going down. So they've got probably 700 mil on the right-hand side, and then they've got the same again and a little bit more on the left-hand side. So they've got ample space for, prepping, serving up. Also as well, we'd obviously incorporated the canopy extractor above it, which they were used to, which they had on the opposite side. So for them, it was a no-brainer to have that, within that sort of same facility there. And then the reason why the sink was on the island, so naturally the plumbing was already there. And also because it's a beautiful big double Belfast, I mean, it's a feature anyway. So having that on your island is, always creates a statement. And also as well, it was where they had they had 2 Perrin & Rowe taps. So they had the bridge tap from Perrin & Rowe with the porcelain levers, which again married up beautifully with the double Belfast. And then they went for the smaller sort of hot tap called the Pathina. And that again had the beautiful porcelain detail on. So it's all interlinking really beautifully. And I believe they went for the satin brass. So it's a live-in finish, but they didn't go for the darkest colour because they knew that those particular taps were going to darken over time, which adds to the character of the beautiful sort of Perrin & Rowe offering. So that's why in this particular scenario, they kept the Belfast sink, but also they didn't have anyone sort of sitting directly opposite them. They had their seating at the end. So if they're splashing, things like that, they're not sat like directly behind them, which I think is always nice. Having the 2 sort of stalls at the end set up works really well. Like if you're having a debrief about your day with your partner, it works really well. If you've got a friend over, a girlfriend, you're having wine, whatever it is, it's really a nice way to keep people integrated and immersed in the sort of the social element, and yourself as well, like being able to easily talk to them. But equally, you're not sort of sitting on top of them because you're not sort of directly facing them, just staring at them. You've got a bit of space between it, which I think is, again, why that works so well. The second design example that you can see on the screen now is total opposite of what I've just shown you. So it's a beautiful, modern, seamless design. The reason as to why the hob is positioned on the island for this particular design is because you've got your ovens directly behind you. So therefore, if you're getting anything sort of hot out of the oven, you can literally just turn around, pop it down next to where you're already cooking by the hob. You could have already some, heat-proof mats or, a grid in order to put any hot stuff coming out of the oven. Equally, you've still got a really big, beautiful sort of drawer pack width again. So I think it was like an 800 or a 900 ml drawer pack either side of the 800 ml hob. So it's a beautiful big island. And so you've got ample space for serving up, prepping, all of that sort of side of it. So therefore it naturally warranted having a venting hob on that side. The reason they wanted to go for a venting hob, I think they're just so popular now, is because of course the extraction goes down, so you're not having to think about suspending anything above you. Like you don't need to check your ceiling to make sure that it can withstand the weight. You don't have to look at your joist sort of above the ceiling to be like, I want this ducted out, like how can I channel that ducting going across. You've got options to go down and have a filter system or to duct out still. So I think that's why layout wise it warranted having the venting hob. Then having the sink up against the window is naturally where the sink is usually positioned in a room. But again, it allowed them to have a specific space to have their bin, dishwasher and sink set up. So again, it's keeping that all in one space as well. What was really nice about the second design is the amount of flexibility that we had to just, create a beautiful big island setup, and we didn't have to think about, having that island a certain depth and thing in order to allow for enough room for your dining room and sort of the lounge setup, things like that. And it just wasn't cramped, which was really lovely. The third design that I've got to show you is what's considered, I'd say, a smaller kitchen, which sounds ridiculous because it's still got a beautiful, island in the middle of it. But this was more like a sort of a kitchen dining room setup. So this would be, I would say, more of a generic space that you might have for like a kitchen diner. So I thought it would be a really great one to show you. And what was really unique in this design is, even though they were going for like a fusion, like a handleless shaker style, they actually had to incorporate and keep sort of a fireplace on the one side, which meant that naturally they couldn't do sort of like an L shape going around and then have the island in the middle. They had to be, mindful and choose either to go for the sink or the hob on the island. And in this particular case, they chose to go for the sink. On the back wall, they had their cooking section and cooking zone all in one area, where they had the hob with a beautiful sort of angled extractor, which again works really well for the seamless quality of a handleless kitchen. But also their ovens was right next to them. So from a flow perspective, again, everything's in one place. They're not thinking the venting hob's behind. You then might have drips and bits of water or bits of washing up where you need to then place your tray out from your oven, to pull it next to your sink if it was the other way around. So I think, again, logically, it worked better to have sink on the island and dishwasher systems, and then have the hob extractor and the oven on the back wall. So I hope looking through those design examples have been helpful. I think it's always great to see what everybody else has done and the reasons as to why that is, to then know what to incorporate and to get to the final decision of which one to incorporate in your design. So the second point I want to talk about today are the things to think about when it comes to adding an appliance on your island, sort of full stop. So naturally, if anything's going on your island, it will need either electric, plumbing, things like routed out, channeled into the floor. So you need to make sure that you're happy with your floor, like having a new floor. It might be a case of that you're knocking through and you've got existing plumbing or wiring, already in the position of where the wall used to be, and that your new kitchen island can sort of, go over that to make sure that any existing pipework and things are covered. So therefore it can just be, altered and rearranged at plinth level in order to get, the plumbing to the right position on that sink. As long as it's sort of over the island, like, you're all good. But of course, in that scenario, you will still need to have a new floor, because if you're knocking a wall through, if that's going all the way across, then naturally you're going to need, you're going to have a big strip that needs to be accounted for from a flooring perspective. So again, something else to think of from there. What's also really great is to check the actual foundation underneath the flooring. So if you've got a property that is older than the 1950s, you may have what's called a suspended sort of timber flooring. Equally, you might still have a concrete section underneath part of the house if you've had like a newer extension or anything like that. Most builders now, obviously put a layer of concrete down as the main foundation, and then can apply, so obviously, like your underfloor heating and then anything sort of on the top of that. So it's good to know what that foundation looks like. A good way of checking whether you do have, concrete or the suspended timber is go outside and check if you've got any air bricks. So they're almost like external little vents on the sort of the bottom of your house going round. If you have those, you most likely have the timber option as opposed to concrete, but it's great to know that you can check that without having to get sort of a builder or anything out from that perspective. Also, it's always good to look at the overall island depth as well, which we've touched on in one of the previous design examples. Check if you are sort of wanting to go for like a venting hob, for instance. You've got to be mindful that you've got to allow for a distance behind it. I normally try and allow 200, 300 mil if you can, but I think you can fill it sort of within 150, dependent on what sort of filter system or ducting system you're going for. You don't necessarily have to do that. Like, you can have the venting hobs sort of going out the back, but then sort of turning within themselves and then affecting the cabinet below. So you can still do that if you're not wanting to increase the depth of your island, but equally you're eating up the usable storage that you've got underneath your venting hob. So that's something to think about. But sometimes that can help with the decision making of being like, okay, we can make this deep enough to then allow for the cabinet depth itself, which is say 560 plus a 20 mil door plus a 20 mil overhang. So in total it's 600 mil. Then you've got a small reduced cabinet at the back if you can at like 300 mil. Then you've got another 300 mil where your guests will be sitting and then having their overhang for them to have their knees underneath the worktop. So again, it's always good just to think about that. And also, as I mentioned, the tightness of the workflow walking around. So the traffic flow, as your guests and you are walking around that space, you don't want to include an island that's, squeezed a venting hob in to make it as deep as possible, and then everyone's sort of, like sardines trying to walk around really close together. So something to think about from there. Also, another point to make is you don't necessarily have to go for induction if you want to go for a venting hob, which sounds ridiculous, but I promise you, like, I still have clients that come to me and they're like, Faye, I just don't get on with induction hobs. I know they're really popular. Obviously, they're more environmentally friendly, and they're potentially worried that, gas will date and it will sort of, get less and less popular. So therefore, it will become an issue at a later stage, especially if they're looking into a forever kitchen. But it's good to note that there are venting hob options that allow for gas, and obviously they've got safety measures in place to make sure that the extraction itself isn't blowing out the gas sort of as you're using it. So one particular example that I have of this with clients where they actually put their venting hob against the wall. We couldn't increase the depth of where the hob is purely because they had a peninsula coming off it. So it would have affected the walkway from the edge to the back wall where they had a big bank of larders. So what we actually did was went for the venting hob with gas, but I rang the particular supplier. So it was the Elica Nikola Tesla Flame model that they went for. And Elica are known and well known within the industry for extraction. And naturally, as the venting hobs have become more and more popular, they now incorporate, you know, lots of different options for that as well. So they're a great company to be aware of if you haven't heard of them. What I managed to do was ring the supplier, so ring Elica, and be like, you know, can we duct it straight out so therefore it's not having to affect the cabinet underneath it? And we managed to do that. It's never best practice is to always make sure that you can allow for the correct sort of C venting system behind the appliance. But in this case, we didn't have that luxury. I thought it'd be a great point to make about the gas venting hob, just to make sure that one, you know that the option is available. Two, you know that it's not just, you know, against a wall that it can be used. It can also be used on an island. Thing to note is just make sure, of course, that you can get the gas to the island. But equally, it might be a case of what I've mentioned before, that if you're knocking through and you've already got sort of a working gas hob, you know, against that wall that's being knocked through, you might have your gas pipe in the same vicinity of where your island will be covering anyway, which would be best case scenario, because then you don't need any sort of new channeling going under the floor and it can be reworked sort of underneath the island, which would be great. Now that we've covered a few design examples and things to look into and be notified about, let's talk about the cost difference between the two now. So we'll be looking at the appliance costs against the additional work needed. So of course, like the plumbing work, like getting sort of plumbing work to your island is going to be the most expensive option. So prices for the sort of the channeling and allowing for that leverage for the water to drain. The cost of that from a builder, for instance, for concrete floor ranges from 1,500 to 2.5k. And for a suspended timber floor is 900 to 1,800. So it's going to be more cost effective from a timber perspective, because naturally, you know, they're not having to chip away at the concrete, which is a very sort of dense and difficult material to cut through, which is what's of course reflected in the cost. I always think that the best way to look at anything from an installation perspective or a building perspective, if it's going to take them long to do, then that's going to be reflected in the cost from that perspective. Now looking at moving your hob onto the island, so naturally it's mostly electrical unless you're going down the gas option, which we've mentioned before. So that will be an additional cost to, again, channel a new passage similar to the plumbing, but it doesn't need to be, of course, at an angle from that perspective. But equally, you've still got to, they will still need to sort of channel it and then have that pipe work coming up underneath your island. So things to think about is, if you are obviously going for an induction hob, normally that's a lot more powerful than the ceramic hobs. So naturally you've got to think about that. But equally as well, if it's a case of you're umming and ahhing whether to have an appliance altogether, but you do have the option not to, I would personally still run cables to your island. Even, you know, if you've got seating, people can sort of, or friends and family can plug in their devices sort of while they're there. Or maybe if it's a big prep station, you could have like a hidden socket of some sort that you can use. So you're not having to have wires going back and forth, you know, across any walkways. You know, I always think it is always great to have electrics on the island, full stop anyway, just to allow for those sort of occasions. Looking into the costs of this now, so assuming that you're having a standard sort of 32 amp circuit and it's a 2.5 meter run to lay the cables down to your island, you'd be looking at a separate sort of electrician cost around 450 to 750 for a timber floor. But again, for a concrete floor, it's going to be higher, which is 750 to 1200 if they have to sort of chase a channel into the concrete, which again, they're not doing that to, you know, add cost on. It is purely that they need to chip. It takes ages to chip away at that channel underneath. So again, more cost effective than the plumbing side of it. But then something to think about is, of course, the sink's going to be the price of the sink anyway. The dishwasher's going to be the price of the dishwasher. You're not having to think about incorporating two appliances together, like with a venting hob. So sometimes actually, although the plumbing is more expensive to get onto the island, still overall cost-wise, it's more cost-effective to do the sink on the island and then still have the separate appliances, dependent on what choice you want to go for on the back wall. But we'll run through the sort of the comparing the labour and appliance costs now. And this is looking at NEF models. I've just got the prices from AO.com. So again, it'd be really easy for you guys at home to do the exercise yourselves if you've got a few different models and things that you're looking into. But say if we're just looking at averages, so the average sort of 80 centimetre induction hob without the venting underneath starts at around £850. Say if you were going for a matching sort of angled hood, so this is still the same width, which of course are more expensive than if you were to go for your 60 centimetres. They're coming out and averaging around £400 to £600. And then for canopy hoods, which are the ones that hide within a mantle or in a cupboard, they're coming out around £300 and £450. If you're working off the average of the angled hood, say it's coming out at £1350 for both of those models together. Then comparing that to a venting hob, so the starting price for a 80 centimetre sort of venting hob in a NEF range is £1650 plus. So naturally, you know, it's still going to be more to go for the venting hob than the combination of having a separate extractor and the usual sort of induction hob. If you wanted to go for the venting hob but also have ducting underfloor, you've got to think about the labour costs included in channeling that through, and that's usually £800 to £1,500 plus. And I think the price difference for this, again, will be based on foundation, distance, and ease in order to get that ducted out straight away. Like, it's always great to make sure that you have the least amount of bends going around to make sure that everything flows out correctly. And then say if you're looking at your kit, so the sort of the C-shaped kit that you usually need behind a venting hob, that could be, you know, £120 plus. So looking at the overall costs of the venting induction hob itself, the channeling and ducting labour cost, as well as the sort of the ducting kit, you're looking at around £2,600, you know, as a whole package. Naturally, that can change dependent on what sort of models and things you want to go for, but it just gives you, you know, a rough overview of how much that will all be together. So now looking at the overall costs of having the setup against a wall, so similar to what you can see behind, we've got an 80 centimetre induction hob, the angled extractor fan, and then allowing, say, £300 plus to duct that either straight out or across if the external wall isn't directly behind the appliance. Overall, you'll be looking at £1,650 for all three of those aspects together, which means that that's just over £900 more cost effective to do the option of having your induction hob extractor and sort of ducting system out on an external wall as opposed to having it on your island. And now comparing that to the sink option, as we mentioned, it's around £1,500 plus for the plumbing work. So it will depend on what type of sink you go for. Say if you go for sort of like a £350 sink or whatever, that takes you to £1,850. And then it depends what tap you go for. If you want to go for a boiling tap, naturally that's going to be, you know, that could be like 2.5K, dependent on whether you're having, you know, the 5-in-1, 3-in-1, 4-in-1 system. And also remember, you need to make sure that you still get electrics to the, you know, to the sink system as well. So maybe you're not wanting to go for a boiling water tap straight away. Maybe it might be something for the future. Make sure that you've got a single socket underneath your sink cabinet for when you are ready to have the boiling water system, because you will need an electrical feed to that as well. But again, it just shows you from a cost perspective how the comparisons work out, and it's not always just the cheaper option to go for your venting hob on your island, even though it's the most popular. And equally from a social aspect, you know, there's a lot, I've had a recent debate about this on TikTok. So our TikTok page is at Love Your Kitchen Podcast, and people send over their questions and I get them answered on video forms for them. And this was a debate of, somebody was like, you know, obviously you'd have your hob on your island because it's more social. But again, if you're one, running the numbers and want to go for the more cost-effective option, or two, you know that your kitchen sink is just like a show sink, again, it would still work really nicely to go for your sink on your island as well. So again, personal preference, but I hope that comparison has helped you. And finally, I just want to cover a few sort of pros and cons to both. So therefore you can make your own mind up of which one you want to go for on your kitchen island. So as we've mentioned, the sink is the most cost-effective option, even though the plumbing is more expensive to channel to. But when you're comparing against sort of the venting hob system, it is more cost effective. A larger sink, I would say, always works best on an island, because say if you do have any trays that need soaking, or you know you've worked with a few big pots, it's great to just have those, you know, in your sink, so that if you're still sat at the island or whatever, you can't really see them just, you know, plastered all over or laid all over the kitchen worktops. That's something to think about, which is why I think a lot of clients like to go for the double Belfast on an island as well. Naturally, it will depend, you know, which style you want to go for as an overall kitchen to determine whether the Belfast is a great option for you. Something else small to note is, because you won't be having any steam if you have your sink on your island, unless you obviously have a hot tap. So if you're going for a boiling water tap, this won't apply. So say if you've got pendants directly over your island, which a lot of homeowners love to do because they look amazing. It's a great way to add a different design element and create a beautiful big statement. Be careful if you are going for your hob underneath your pendant lights, because sometimes no matter how amazing the extraction rate is and how much it's sucking the odours down and, you know, being as effective as possible, you can still get, if you've got sort of a glass sort of globe set up above and they're quite low, you could see the build-up of gunk inside of those. So something to think about from there. Also as well, having your sink on the island, that might be where you want to prep, especially if you've got a waste disposal underneath your sink. We do at home, so I actually do my prep work near my sink, so I can scrape all of the veggies that I've used, you know, into the sink, and then it goes down into the waste disposal. So if that's the case, prep work I always find takes so much longer sometimes than the actual cooking side of it itself. Then that would be great to do that and be more social on having that on your island. Pros for having the hob on the island: of course, it's great for socialising when you're actually cooking. It's more of an interactive cooking experience for everybody as well, because they feel more involved. Aesthetically, it looks great. I think that's why it's so popular as well. You know, there's nothing vertical coming out from the work surface. It's just nice and flush, looks very clean. You can also get it now where you've got models that are actually underneath your worktop, so that you can't actually see anything, but then you know where to place your pans and things, which are the very sort of premium kitchens. But again, I believe, you know, over the years that will start to become a little bit more mainstream. Also as well, if you're maybe not a fan of the venting hobs, if you're not, I would stress for you to go and see one working to make that judgment, because they have come on a lot than when they used to. Like, they're great from an odour perspective. They're great from, you know, a cleaning perspective. There's lots of safety features on there. You know, it extracts really well. The extraction rate are usually really high. So I would push you to try them first before making that mind up. But equally, if it's still the same and you're like, they're just not for me, of course, looking to go for a ceiling option is a way to make, you know, a beautiful big statement. You might want it to be quite discreet into your ceiling. You might want to incorporate it into your lighting system and have a big bespoke sort of extractor system above. We've had Westin on the show before. They're an amazing Westin cooker hoods. They're an amazing company and they extract so well. And I've had so many clients say to me that it's the best extractors that they've ever had. But equally, you've got to think about the uplifting cost to be able to do that as well. So yeah, there's lots of pros and cons to both. I hope I've covered everything that you need me to today. If I haven't, drop me over some more questions, or let me know what's been really helpful for you and sort of what decision you've chosen based off watching or listening to this podcast episode today. As I always say, thank you so much for listening, and I'm hoping it's helping you get closer to the decision making that you need to for your kitchen design. Equally, if you feel like you still need some help, I do offer a freelance kitchen and bedroom design service. All you'll need to do is book a 20-minute free discovery call through my website, which is a great opportunity for me to learn more about your project and you and how you use your space, but also to look through sort of my design packages and see if we're the right fit for your kitchen project. Thank you for taking the time to watch this video today. If you have liked what we have spoken about, why not like and subscribe to this YouTube channel. Also, what you can do is click on the notification bell to keep yourself notified of all the new content to come.